Okay, so yes, the viola, a big violin, a small cello, or just a joke. What is a viola? So I was a viola player, I still am, for about 25 years. And I must have been asked that question hundreds of times. Is it like a violin, people would inquire. So I'd usually say yes, it looks a bit like a large violin. Oh, well, is it that thing that you play between your legs? No, I'd say. Trying to be patient, that's a cello. The viola's smaller than that. And by the way, if you try and put your cello underneath your chin, you might have to go to emergency. So that's how I would describe the cello. It's bigger than the violin, it's smaller than the cello. And actually, I was kind of proud of playing an instrument that many people didn't know. But then, at some point, you may remember this point, at some point in the mid-80s, we had viola jokes. Do you remember your first viola joke? My first viola joke was, how do you get a viola player to play a passage pianissimo tremolando? That's with the bow shaking. And the answer is, mark it solo. Viola players are renowned for our bad nerves. So this was very cruel, obviously. And I'll prove that to you in a little while. And it also cut my pride absolutely down to size. So was the instrument I was playing really only something that existed either as a joke or to be compared with the violin and the cello? And actually, where does that leave the double bass? Hello? So I swallowed my pride and I sort of perversely enjoyed this attention that viola jokes brought to us viola players. By the way, may I ask, how many viola players are there here today? Oh, how fantastic! How many of you have got your instruments? Oh, none of you? Oh, you can come and play mine afterwards. You probably do more practice than I do. So anyway, what I did was that I repeated good jokes that I'd heard along the way. So jokes such as, why do people take an instant dislike to the viola? It saves time. There's more. What's the difference between a viola and a trampoline? You take your shoes off to jump on a trampoline. And what's the difference between a viola and an onion? No one cries when you cut up a viola. So, of course, we all laugh at these jokes. And I was kind of happy to perpetuate this hilarity. I mean, who doesn't want to make people laugh? But there's also a little bit of me that sort of felt a bit guilty. I didn't hear any other jokes about other instruments, except some rude joke about French horn players. So why did my instrument have to be ridiculed like this? I was beginning to feel like a Tasmanian. So I ceased playing the viola after about 15 years, and I was a professional. And then I began the instrument that I wanted to play since I was 8, the cello. But the viola has led me to so many things for which I'm so grateful. And so I thought that what I should do is, for you, investigate what this viola is. Is it a big violin, a small cello, or just a joke? So just sort of briefly, I thought maybe we could go into a bit of the history of the modern violin family. So the immediate predecessor to the modern violin family is the viol group of instruments. That's spelled V-I-O-L. By the way, or at least mostly. And so that includes the viola da gamba, viol of the leg, the viola da braccio, viol of the arm, and the bass viol, viol of the pub, I think. And these instruments are probably developed from the Spanish viola or vihuela and the Moorish rebab or rebec. So the rebab was brought to Spain by the Moors in their conquest in the 8th century. And that was taken to Italy by Sephardic Jews escaping the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th century. So the modern violin family has very strong Islamic roots. And the north of Italy in the 16th century, had this relative stability. And there were these fantastic painters around the time, particularly Ferrari, this true Renaissance man. And he was instrumental in developing the modern violin because he started to experiment with various forms. And one of these paintings by Ferrari, there's this little toddler, very plump, as only Renaissance toddlers can be, or American ones, and precariously is holding this equally plump violin and bow. And that's possibly one of the earliest paintings of the actual violin. So none of Ferrari's experiments survived. But those of the experiments of Amati survived from the 1500s. and also Gasparo di Sarlo. Still some of his instruments around. They're worth millions. They're extraordinary instruments. So they are credited with some of the first violins, first violas. And what happens is that instruments, of course, are usually created from demand. And because there was a significant change in music around this time, there was a significant change in demand. And this is 16th century Italy. So there was this thing called a frottola. Now, it sounds like something that we're about to have at lunch after I've done this talk, but it's actually it's a type of secular song. And this particular song brought more attention to the top line of the harmony. And so what they needed was this bright-sounding violin rather than a viol to match this sound instrumentally. And Amati and Di Sarlo made instruments, these larger violas, to kind of start to match now the inner parts of the song. Violas at this point were very, very large. I think very few of us have arms long enough to play these massive instruments. My viola, which is actually Italian, it was made in the 1800s though. This is 16 3/4. The body, that's inches, by the way, not donuts. These other instruments are probably that much larger. So if you imagine the actual finger length, will be all the way out to there, and just this massive instrument. But there was a crucial event that happened to form these very different careers between violin and viola. It was the advent of the trio sonata in the 17th and 18th century. The viola wasn't in a trio sonata. There was a violin, and a bass continuo. And this was a disaster. There were also these violin virtuosos that became incredibly successful, people like Vivaldi. And that meant that very, very few people bothered to play the viola. Demand dropped. And that's probably why nowadays, you think of those hundreds of violins by Stradivarius, there are 10 violas which have survived by Stradivarius. So hundreds of violins, 10 violas. By the way, there's one for sale at the moment. Peter Schiffloff's viola, Peter Schiffloff from the Amadeus Quartet, his viola's for sale. So, I don't know, how's your saving going? If you own property in Sydney, you could probably just sell your 2-bedroom flat and be able to buy it. So the viola was actually still needed, and J.S. Bach preferred the viola over the violin. And one of his biographers said about Bach, he said that with this instrument, he was, as it were, in the center of the harmony, where he could hear and enjoy to the utmost what was going on both sides of him. So I thought that we could just to have a kind of flavor of this. Oren is on sound. Thank you, Oren. Just have a tiny little bit of the Brandenburg Concerto No. 6, the best piece in the whole world. Okay, this should be it. Thanks, Oren. Isn't that the most wonderful sound? It's so silvery. And there's sort of a lack of strain in these double violas. If you played that on 2 violins, I think it would sound rather tense. So, unfortunately, Bach only left this work for solo violas. But then there's also, if you think about Fauré with his work, his Requiem, there's no violins in that, just at the end. And that, again, leaves a very sort of calm sound. The viola absolutely found its niche in the string quartet. So Haydn played the viola, Mozart played the viola. But there's another viola joke. What's the difference between a chainsaw and a viola? If you absolutely had to, you could use a chainsaw in a string quartet. Only if you had to, though. So also another thing is that there were very few viola virtuosos. That meant that nobody bothered writing viola concertos. That meant that nobody bothered practicing the viola, and so it became this vicious cycle. And it wasn't until we have these men such as Lionel Curtis, William Primrose, who came to live in Australia at the end of his life and actually taught Richard Tognetti, Paul Hindemit, and now we have people like Yuri Bashmet. And it's now that the viola is beginning to stand more on a par with the violin and the cello. But the question is, do people still think of the viola as a big violin? So let's just have a think about the viola and its position in the hierarchy of the orchestra. here's a little joke. So once there was a viola player playing in the Winnipeg Symphony. He wasn't that great, but he was cleaning out his attic one day and he discovered an old lamp. He gave it a rub and out popped a genie, as they do. And he said, for letting me out of my lamp, I'll grant you 3 wishes. The viola player thought for a moment and he said, okay, I would like to be a far better musician than I am now. The genie said, go to sleep and it will be done. And he woke up and he was the principal viola player of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. He thought, oh, this is great. So he rubbed the genie again. The genie said, okay, you get another wish. I would like to be an even better musician. The genie told him to go to bed. He woke up and he was now principal viola player of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. Well, the violist was getting pretty excited about this, but he knew that life could be better. And he rubbed on the lamp again. Once more, out came the genie. This is your last wish, warned the genie. I want to be an even better musician. So yet again, he was told to go to sleep. And the next morning, he woke up. He surprisingly found himself back in the orchestra that he had started in, the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. And this time, he was sitting in the last desk of the second violin section. Ah, what a heady rise to fame. So, look, this might be an exaggeration, but actually it is the exact story of Lionel Curtis, this famous viola player. In his autobiography, which was surprisingly called My Viola and I, what a brilliant title, Curtis was actually in the back of the second violins, I stress, in the back of the second violins at Sir Henry Wood's orchestra in the early 1900s. He'd been doing, a few minutes of viola practice in his spare time, and happened to play to Sir Henry, and he was immediately promoted to principal viola. And that was it, after 5 minutes practice a day. So, look, I used to be a violinist, and then I was a rubbish violinist, and somebody said, why don't you try playing the viola? I've got big hands. They probably don't look very big from the back, but they are, seriously. And at college, we played the same pieces as the violinists, the same studies as the violinists, things like Kreutzer, Roder, Daunt, but we usually played them 2 or 3 years later than the violinists played them. And there's another joke about transcribing a violin piece for viola. What you do is you divide the metronome mark by half. And in fact, the composer Krantz, who was composing in the 1700s, he wrote about how lazy viola players were. He said so few violists devote as much energy to their work as they should. If they applied the necessary industry, they could easily improve their lot in a large establishment, instead of remaining chained to the viola for the rest of their lives. So viola jokes, I think, have been around for a lot longer than since the 80s. So look, the viola is pretty much the same as the violin. You can see the proportions are slightly different. A viola is much less standard than a violin. Violin is usually about 14.5 inches, or maybe 14 inches. Viola can range from anywhere from 15 inches, the body I'm talking about, to 17.5 inches. It's a deeper instrument. And here, I'll just turn this music off. With the violin, this is one of the terrible things of the violin. Well, that one I think is a terrible thing of the violin. Sorry, are there any violinists here? Oh, none. Oh, how marvellous. Oh, no, there are. Oh, I thought we were a violin-free environment. Okay. So a viola has a top string of an A, and then the D string, a G string, and then that true joy of every honest viola player, the C string. And, isn't that just the most wonderful sound? The violin has an E string. Okay, it really sounds like this. At least that's what it sounds like when I play it. I'm sure you're a much better violinist than me. So, Frederick Riddle, who used to be the principal viola player of the London Symphony Orchestra, I was lucky enough to meet him when I was about 16 years old. And one of the things about the viola is that it's a heavy instrument, and it's actually, you need to develop your muscles to hold this instrument up. One time he was having a beer in a pub in England. A farmer came up to him and said, oh, you're a bit of a wuss just playing a musical instrument. And Frederick Riddle challenged this farmer, he was a beefy guy. He challenged him to just simply hold his viola up for 5 minutes. The farmer couldn't do it. Actually, I was going to ask for a volunteer, but I'm not sure we've quite got time. No violinist need apply. Yehudi Menuhin also loved the viola. He said that it was like endowing oneself with another voice. It's like growing a beard and finding one's weak chin suddenly authoritative. Isn't that great? You might like to just write that down, violinists. I think it said weak chin. So, viola players, Menuhin says, viola players, we're serious musicians and we enjoy music, the heart of music, rather than just all this sort of flashy playing. And this would imply that viola players have a certain degree of mental agility. We like to think we do. But there's a joke about this, of course. So a violinist at the end of each rehearsal would look, and at the beginning, in fact, would look at the inside flap of his jacket before he sat down. And this went on for several decades. And one time, it was very hot, and he'd taken off his jacket and left it on his chair during a break. There was a curious oboe player, and he went over to see what was written on the inside of the jacket. And he pulled back the flap and saw this little note pinned on the inside, and it said, "Viola left hand, bow right hand." The viola can be virtuosic. Check this out. Oren. Isn't that great? Thanks, Oren. It's Hindemit. It's a Hindemit solo sonata. I used to be able to play that, but not anymore. That's why I've got a recording of it. But the viola is virtuosic, but perhaps amusingly, Hindemith, who was himself a viola player, he directed in that piece that tone production was secondary, of secondary importance. So you could scrape as much as you wanted, which is, obviously a delight. So there are more differences to the viola and the violin than simply the viola burns longer, and that's usually because it's still in its case. So one shame I think about a viola is that it's so infrequently that viola players are taught the viola from the beginning. Often we learn the violin. It's so often the case. We play the violin, somebody says, "Oh, you've got big hands," and you are then taught the viola, often by a violinist. So I suppose a sporting analogy might be a cricketer who's trying to learn cricket from somebody who's only ever played baseball. And I think the viola will only ever really reach its true place in the musical pantheon when we actually train viola players right from the beginning of their musical life. Now, is the viola a small cello? Well, the immediate difference is we don't have a spike. We often use something called a shoulder rest. This detaches, or at least it should detach from the viola. I think sometimes viola players do actually stick them on and then try and close the case with disastrous consequences. But a viola doesn't have a spike. Although, if you have a little kid who's learning the cello, you can add a spike to a viola and turn a viola into a cello. You really can. So the viola is the same pitch as the cello, but it's an octave higher. The viola quite often takes over from the cello when there is a cello line, like the cello has the tune. So just to give you a very quick example of this, in a Haydn quartet, listen out for the viola part. The cello has the tune and the viola has taken over with the bass. So I'll just change that. Okay, so this is a Haydn Sun quartet. Can you hear the viola player going bum, 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 bum? Yeah. Thanks, Oren. I think that the viola absolutely is at its best when it's in the string quartet, but it can never be a cello. You know, it will never have that big, rich sound. And the viola player or violas work best when we're in the middle, when we're creating this rich gooiness. You know, we're like butter in cooking. We bring everything together, or at least we like to think so. So, is the viola just a joke? Well, the thing is, why do we tell jokes? We tell jokes when we don't understand something. We tell jokes when we feel guilty. So people don't understand viola players because we've turned our back, generally, on pyrotechnical displays. Violinists can sometimes feel angry towards viola players because often we don't have to practice quite as much, or at least, hang on a minute, do we actually? And also violinists and cellists might also feel guilty because this is an instrument that's been neglected for hundreds of years, and we're now having to kind of scrabble back to get our respectability. But just because people want to make jokes about viola players and violas, does that mean that we should make the viola actually into a joke? And of course we shouldn't. Composers throughout their lives have turned to the viola for the most somber and intimate works. If you think about Shostakovich, and the final work he wrote was for the viola, a viola sonata, and his string quartet number 13 begins and ends with a viola solo of the utmost horror that you almost, you have to go out and find some humanity after you've listened to it. All these great Western classical musicians played the viola: Bach, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, Dvorak, Hindemit, Lalo, Giuliani, Mendelssohn, Schubert, Frank Bridge, Benjamin Britten, and Jimi Hendrix. They all played the viola. So why would all these highly skilled musicians play an instrument that was just a joke? So the viola, it's not a big violin. Its similarities are greater to the violin than to the cello, but it's definitely not a cello. The sound is completely different. And it's certainly not a joke when you listen to the viola music that has been composed, even though there are so many jokes about the viola. So what is the viola? Well, if you don't know what something is, I reckon it's always good to turn to a dictionary. Isn't that great? It's like, what does the dictionary say about it? The Oxford Dictionary of Music, which is our Bible, it simply states that the viola is a bowed, four-stringed instrument. And in my more fanciful moments, I'd also say, with a lot of evidence from the viola's repertoire, that it's an instrument to which composers have turned when they want to speak their innermost thoughts. I believe that the viola is absolutely at the heart of music, and lessons are available for you from your nearest music school. Would you like me to play you a little something on my viola? Okay. Now I have to stand here because it needs to be mic'd for the recording. So I'm sorry if you can't, see my whole body, but frankly it might be better if you're further away from me. Before I was going to play you a little bit of Bach, which is actually a piece which is written for the cello, but I think it sounds much better on the viola. But before I play you the Bach, here I must just play you the first solo that I ever played as a viola player when I was 12 years old. And you will see just how virtuosic a viola player has to be. This is the viola part from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the Spring Concerto, the slow movement. Watch out, hang on a minute, it's a difficult bit now, I've got to change notes. And that's it. Pretty good, huh? Oh, and I should also show you what I needed to do to get a distinction in grade 8 viola. How cool is that? I can hold the viola from memory. Okay, so I'll just play you a little beret. I wrote about this. I've just written a book called Cadence, and write about playing this beret to various people along the way, cycling from England to Hong Kong. And I played this so many times, I really hope that I now don't forget it when I play it in front of you. I'm just going to play the major one. Thank you. Thanks.